Yet the state's 19th-century pioneer in the field was dismissed during his lifetime as a crank. John Gorey, a medical doctor who moved to steamy North Florida in 1833 determined to alleviate yellow fever outbreaks, was once described by a New York Globe writer as a crank who thinks he can make ice by his machine as good as God Almighty. Naturally, he died scorned and penniless. He ran the very first bank out of Pensacola, Florida. He was a postmaster, which was a very lucrative job. He was a mayor here in town. A cure for yellow fever? The Spaniards, the first Europeans to settle in Florida in the mid-1500s, could never attract enough people to live on the peninsula and eventually ceded the land to the United States in 1819. Born in 1803, Gorey spent his sweat-drenched life in Florida searching for ways to create winter with the goal of defeating yellow fever. Outbreaks of the often deadly disease were more terrifying than hurricanes. The New York-trained doctor quickly linked the yellow fever to heat, but was convinced that it was transmitted by what was known as swamp gas. His solution: cool the patient's room with machine-made ice. It took another 50 years for experts to realize that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, which thrive in swamps and die in the cold. Which is why today the nation calls him the father of refrigeration, and not an amazing doctor, said Roundtree. But he was an amazing doctor, he just finds himself fighting the wrong thing at the right place. The crazy ice machine. Gorey's machine is a steam engine with a series of cranks and handles held in a wooden frame on a brick platform that condenses and expands air until, thanks to the thermodynamic cycle discovered just years earlier, it produces ice. Hot air, which tends to rise, was thus cooled, and eventually the room temperature, and the patient's fever, would drop. Gorey was far ahead of his time when he patented his machine. Religious Americans, however, were unprepared for a device, clearly inspired by the devil, that could reproduce God's creation. It had nothing to do with God but, instead, science, Roundtree said. Which you know today probably doesn't still walk hand in hand with religion. He may have improved the lives of his patients, but Gorey was unable to sell his ice-making machine. He died in 1855, mocked and bankrupt. The first proper air conditioning machine came out about half a century after his death. Dr. G came up with a brilliant, far-sighted innovation that helped people, so of course he was labeled a crackpot and died penniless, only to be honored by the state after his death, said Craig Pittman, a local writer specializing in the offbeat stories that Florida is well known for. Florida was the least populated U.S. state up to the 1940s. Hotels closed during the summer because of the heat and the clouds of mosquitoes that descended on visitors. It wasn't until air conditioning became popular and pesticides like DDT came into use in the 1950s that Florida became truly habitable. Everyone said he was a crazy man, said Roundtree.